The cameras hadn't even started rolling when people inside the G20 hall noticed it. A single chair, one usually filled by the most powerful nation in the world, sat untouched. No movement, no flag, no delegation arranging papers or whispering last-minute briefings. Just an empty seat in a room representing nearly three-quarters of humanity. And for a moment, the silence around that empty space felt louder than any speech. Outside the conference center, ordinary South Africans gathered by the barricades, curious and hopeful. Some held small flags, others carried handmade signs welcoming leaders from across the world. Many of them didn't know the fine details of economics or geopolitics. What they knew was simpler. This was the first G20 summit held on African soil. A moment of pride, a moment of change, a moment that said the world was shifting whether the great powers liked it or not. Inside that empty chair became a symbol of something deeper. The 20th century was shaped by concentration of wealth, of power, of influence. But this century, it's beginning with dispersion. Technology spreading, production moving, young nations rising, and the global South Africa, Latin America, South Asia finally stepping into rooms where they weren't just guests, but partners. Canada's delegation entered with a sense of purpose. Their leader spoke calmly but firmly about adapting to a world where influence is no longer monopolized by any one capital. About signing new deals with South Africa. About investing across Africa. About preparing for a century shaped not by a single superpower, but by multilateral cooperation, and by nations ready to embrace the shift rather than resist it. For Americans watching from home, especially those who remember the Cold War, this moment raises a profound question. If global power is truly moving, what does it mean for the United States? And can America keep its footing in a world where Africa is becoming a central force, not a quiet one? Before we continue, tell me this. Do you believe the rise of Africa leaders like Ibrahim Traore, alliances like the AES, and partnerships across the global South will reshape the world your generation helped build? If you're among the few who want the truth behind this global shift, stay with me. And please consider subscribing, because the headlines won't tell you what's really happening. When the official session finally opened, the atmosphere inside the G20 hall felt unusually grounded, almost heavy with the realization that this gathering represented more than just economic cooperation. It represented a turning point in world history. Delegations looked across the room and saw something that past generations of diplomats would never have imagined: the global South occupying not the sidelines, but the center. South Africa presiding. Dozens of African ministers walking confidently between sessions, new economic alliances forming in real time. And yet the empty seat of the United States remained a quiet reminder that the world was no longer guaranteed to move in one direction. To understand the significance of this moment, you have to picture what the G20 actually is today. Despite being only 20 nations, the group represents nearly 75% of the world's population, 2/3 of global GDP, and 3/4 of world trade. This makes it by far the single most influential gathering of economic power anywhere on Earth. And this year, not because of war, not because of any logistical issue, but purely out of political choice, the United States did not show up in its formal capacity. For many in the hall, it felt like watching a shift in gravity. In previous decades, such an absence would have stalled the entire summit, maybe even collapsed the agenda. But not this year. Under South Africa's leadership, the proceedings continued, and the tone was unmistakably assertive. The world will no longer wait for Washington to move before moving itself. Canada's leader captured this shift directly. Standing at the podium, he didn't speak in dramatic tones. He didn't criticize the United States. Instead, he explained calmly that the 21st century would not be defined by concentration of power, but by diffusion of technology, energy, influence, and opportunity. This wasn't a prediction. It was an acknowledgement of something already happening on the ground. To make his point clear, he highlighted how Canada was preparing for this new landscape by signing new agreements with new partners, most notably South Africa. While major headlines in the West were focused on political arguing, Canada had quietly opened a new FinDev Canada office in Cape Town, a move designed to fund sustainable development projects and give Canadian companies a permanent gateway into African markets. It was a strategic signal that Africa's economic rise is not a distant dream, but an immediate priority. That announcement alone sparked noticeable interest among other delegations. Some African ministers smiled knowingly. They recognized this for what it was, a Western nation acknowledging the continent as an emerging powerhouse rather than an aid-dependent region. For decades, African leaders had complained that their nations were invited to conferences but excluded from strategy. This time, strategy itself was shifting toward them. Beyond development financing, Canada and South Africa also agreed to begin formal discussions on a foreign investment protection agreement, the type of treaty that usually signals long-term high-value partnerships involving clean energy infrastructure and critical minerals. These are not symbolic deals. They are the building blocks of a future where Africa becomes central to battery technology, renewable energy, and the next generation of industrial supply chains. And they are also a subtle signal to the United States that old patterns of trade dependence are disappearing. Then came one of the most important, though understated, announcements. Canada had advanced a new critical minerals production alliance building on the G7 standards roadmap. In plain terms, it means Canada wants a secure, trusted, and ethical supply of minerals, and Africa is the key. South Africa's agreement to deepen cooperation on mineral sourcing was more than diplomatic nicety. It was a sign that Africa, long exploited for its raw materials, was now entering partnerships where it could negotiate from a position of strength. All of this unfolded under the umbrella theme set by South Africa's solidarity, equality, and sustainability, principles that Canada openly embraced. And for many watching, it felt like a quiet, yet decisive moment, the kind that signals the beginning of a new global architecture. For the first time in generations, the G20 was not simply a stage for the great powers. It was a negotiation table for a world learning to live without a single center of gravity. The true turning point of the summit didn't come from a dramatic speech or a confrontation. It came from something almost ordinary, a closed-door discussion between Canada, Japan, several European leaders, and their national security teams. Inside that smaller room, away from the cameras and the ceremonial flags, the tone was sharper, more urgent, because this was where decisions about war, peace, and global alignment were actually being shaped. Hours earlier, Canada's leader had spoken about embracing a world of dispersed power, but inside this room he showed what that actually looked like in practice. Here he stood not behind a podium, but at eye level with his counterparts, leaders from Europe, Japan, and senior advisors from different capitals. These were the nations that called themselves the Coalition of the Willing. They were not waiting for anyone else, not even the United States, to set the direction. For decades, discussions on Ukraine would have naturally revolved around Washington's position. Yet this time, without the U.S. present at the summit in an official capacity, the conversation felt different, strangely liberated. The leaders weren't rebelling. They weren't challenging America. But they were acting on the reality that the global order had moved beyond a single anchor. In that room, they formed what Canada's leader later called a common position. It wasn't loud. It wasn't staged for media impact, but it was decisive. They agreed on a unified stance regarding the 28-point peace framework for Ukraine, the diplomatic pathways still open, and the areas where additional pressure or negotiation was needed. And then something quietly historic happened. They agreed that nobody needed to call President Donald Trump to seek approval or communicate this joint position. That alone signaled a wider political shift, one that even many Americans watching might find unsettling. Instead of a phone call to Washington, the message would be delivered through coordinated national security channels. Canada, Japan, and several European nations would have their security advisors meet in Geneva the next morning. From there, the agreed strategy would be communicated to Ukraine and the rest of the coalition. Canada's leader even mentioned he would follow up personally with President Zelensky later that day, not to ask permission, but to close the loop on the strategy their group had shaped together. For many observers inside the G20 hall, this was the moment that defined the summit. Not the speeches, not the photo sessions, but the emergence of a diplomatic center of gravity that no longer relied on one capital and no longer faltered when the most powerful country chose to step aside. News of the meeting spread quickly across delegations. African ministers interpreted it as validation that the world was entering a multipolar era, one where collaboration mattered more than hierarchy. South American representatives saw it as an opening for their own voices to carry more weight in future geopolitical decisions. European diplomats, though still anxious about America's unpredictable engagement, quietly welcomed the show of unity among like-minded allies. The reactions were layered among African delegations. There was an undercurrent of pride. If Canada, Japan, and Europe could unite without waiting for approval from Washington, then perhaps Africa too could break from old dependencies and chart its own course, much like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were already doing through the AS alliance. Among European leaders, the sentiment was mixed relief that they hadn't been paralyzed by U.S. absence, but concern about what this meant for long-term transatlantic relations. The world they grew up in post-WN2's American-led predictable was fading. Among U.S.-aligned diplomats attending informally, there was discomfort. Not hostility, but a quiet realization that America's leverage might be diluted when it chose not to show up. Among the Canadian press pool and civil society representatives watching nearby, there was a sense of renewed national confidence. Canada wasn't trying to dominate anything yet, it was shaping outcomes in a way that rewarded diplomacy, steadiness, and presence. The apex of the summit wasn't a moment of tension, it was a moment of clarity, a realization shared across continents that the post-Cold War era was over and the world had stepped almost without noticing into a new equilibrium. The G20 didn't collapse because the United States stayed home. It adapted. It moved forward. And in doing so, it showed everyone from South Africa to Canada to the AES nations of West Africa that the future would belong not to the loudest power, but to the broadest coalition willing to act. The ripple effects of this G20 moment were felt far beyond the marble floors of the conference center. While diplomats were drafting talking points and security advisors were preparing their follow-up meetings in Geneva, ordinary people workers, students, small business owners were already starting to feel what this shift could mean for their daily lives. In South Africa, where the summit was hosted, the conversations on the streets began to change. Shopkeepers in Cape Town, who usually paid little attention to high-level geopolitics, were suddenly discussing Canada's decision to open a FinDev office in their city. Local radio stations explained what critical mineral cooperation could bring: new infrastructure projects, more stable jobs, and the possibility that African resources might finally be processed on African soil rather than shipped out raw. For young South Africans who had grown up under the long shadow of unemployment, this wasn't abstract policy, it was hope. But the civil effects didn't stop in South Africa. Across the continent, in countries like Zambia, Namibia, Kenya, and Ghana, people watched the summit closely. Many asked the same question: if Canada can engage Africa directly without needing America to validate the relationship, what other opportunities might appear? Some African commentators even argued that the absence of the United States at this summit unintentionally gave the continent more space to assert itself. Without a dominant voice overshadowing the proceedings, African leaders could speak plainly about minerals, investment conditions, and sovereignty. Meanwhile, in Canada, the political implications were equally significant. For decades, Canada's economy had been deeply tied to the United States, so closely woven together that any change in Washington's trade policies or tariffs could spill over into Canadian households. But now, with the world shifting and America oscillating between global leadership and retreat, Canadian citizens began to debate the necessity of diversification. Editorial writers described the G20 as a wake-up call, a reminder that Canada needed multiple trade pathways, not just one. Some Canadians felt reassured by their government's proactive approach. Others were anxious. Older voters remembered the post-war order built around U.S. stability and feared that moving too far from Washington could create economic vulnerability. But even they could not deny the logic behind their leader's message. The future belonged to diversified partnerships, and Africa was becoming one of the most important. On the global stage, the political consequences were even more pronounced. When Canada, Japan, and European partners formed a unified position on Ukraine without involving the United States directly, it sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. Analysts quickly noted that this was not a rejection of the U.S., but a recalibration of global influence. It showed that multilateral cooperation did not have to depend on American participation to be legitimate. For African nations, especially those in the ACE alliance, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the implications were profound. Their leaders had spent the past 2 years arguing that Africa should not wait for Western powers to approve its decisions. Watching G20 leaders coordinate without Washington reinforced this principle. Commentators in Ouagadougou and Bamako openly suggested that if Africa strengthened internal alliances, it too could negotiate global terms instead of accepting them. The shift also exposed a deeper civil truth: people across continents were growing tired of relying on a single source of authority to determine global direction. Many citizens, whether in Europe, Africa, or North America, felt that the world was becoming too interconnected, too diverse to be guided by one nation alone. This realization carried both optimism and uncertainty. Optimism because more nations, particularly those long marginalized, were finding their place at the table. Uncertainty because multipolar systems can be unpredictable, requiring careful navigation and diplomatic maturity. Yet one thing became clear after the summit: the civil and political consequences of this G20 were not temporary. They marked the beginning of a new global rhythm, one where nations large and small must learn to collaborate, negotiate, and compete in ways that reflect a world with many centers of gravity. From the perspective of the United States, the G20 summit unfolded like a distant storm, loud enough to be heard, but not close enough to compel action. For many Americans who had grown accustomed to seeing their nation at the center of every global forum, footage of that empty chair struck an emotional chord. It wasn't a scandal, it wasn't a crisis, but it was a reminder of something deeper. The world was learning to move without waiting for Washington to lead. Across American news networks, the reactions varied sharply. Older commentators, especially those who remembered the height of U.S. influence after World War II, expressed discomfort. They had spent their lifetimes believing the United States was the irreplaceable leader of the global order. Seeing Canada, Japan, and European nations coordinating a unified strategy on Ukraine without routing it through Washington felt unfamiliar, even unsettling. One retired diplomat said it plainly: "This is the first time in my career I've seen major allies forge a position without America setting the tone." Yet other analysts offered a different interpretation. They argued that America's absence was not the collapse of anything, but the confirmation of a trend already underway. The world was becoming multipolar, and the global South was no longer willing to play a passive role. In this reading, the G20 was not drifting away from the United States, it was simply expanding its orbit to include new centers of gravity. Africa, South Asia, and South America were no longer peripheral, they were becoming essential. That shift was visible across the summit. African journalists emphasized how refreshing it felt to see debates on minerals, infrastructure, and climate policies unfold without the typical shadow of U.S. dominance. For decades, Africa's development pathways had been shaped, sometimes constrained by American or European preferences. But this time, South Africa chaired the meeting, Canada invested directly into African markets, and multiple nations discussed partnerships that did not revolve around Washington. In Europe, the reaction was more complex. Many leaders welcomed the show of unity with Canada, and Japan relieved that strategic alignment could continue despite American unpredictability. But beneath that relief was anxiety. Europeans understood that a world not led by the United States was a world where they would need to assume far more responsibility for security diplomacy and crisis management. For a continent long accustomed to leaning on Washington's military and political weight, this was a sobering thought. Japan, meanwhile, viewed the moment with strategic clarity. For decades, Tokyo had relied on American stability in Asia, especially in the face of rising Chinese influence. But Japan also recognized that global cooperation could not remain hostage to any single nation's internal politics. Its participation in forming a joint position with Canada and Europe signaled Japan's readiness to act in a world where alliances had to be flexible, not hierarchical. Perhaps the most striking shift came from Africa itself. Leaders, journalists, and civil society groups from Ghana to Kenya to Burkina Faso interpreted America's absence as symbolic, not negative. Not disrespectful, simply symbolic of a new reality. The age of unilateral power was ending. Nations like Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traore had already begun asserting models of sovereignty that challenged old patterns of dependency. The G20 merely reflected that broader awakening. For Americans watching from home, especially older generations who lived through Vietnam, the Cold War, and the long arc of U.S. global leadership, the question hung in the air. If the world is no longer waiting for America, what role should America choose next? And is the rise of Africa and the global South a threat or an opportunity to rebuild global relationships on more equal terms? As the final session of the summit drew to a close, the energy inside the hall felt unmistakably different from the way it had begun. What started as a meeting overshadowed by an empty American chair ended as something far bigger, a quiet declaration that the world was entering a new phase. Not a phase defined by conflict or confrontation, but by redistribution of voice, of influence, of opportunity. Delegates packed their folders, exchanged farewells, and prepared for the journey home. But the conversations they carried with them, those would echo far longer than the official speeches. They had witnessed the emergence of a G20 capable of functioning, even thriving, without depending on a single superpower to set the tone. They had seen alliances form in real time, and they had seen Africa not as a passive observer, but as an active architect of the global future. For Americans watching this unfold, the message is both sobering and empowering. The world is not turning against the United States. It is merely growing beyond the idea that only one nation can steer its direction. Multipolarity is not abandonment, it is evolution. And evolution offers choices. The real question now is how America chooses to respond. Will the United States reclaim a leadership grounded in partnership rather than dominance? Will it recognize that the rise of the Global South is not a threat, but an invitation to rebuild trust and collaboration? Or will it step back, allowing other nations, Canada, South Africa, Japan, the AS alliance to define the rules of this new century? The answer matters because global power doesn't vanish. It shifts. And right now, it is shifting toward places many Americans were taught to overlook. Countries like Burkina Faso, once dismissed as too small to matter, are now shaping conversations about sovereignty, resources, and economic independence. Leaders like Ibrahim Traore are becoming symbols of a wider African reawakening, one driven not by aid or dependency, but by dignity and self-determination. These movements are not isolated stories. They are part of the broader transformation shaping Africa news headlines every week: local manufacturing, mineral control, infrastructure reform, and regional alliances that challenge old geopolitical patterns. This G20 summit did not answer all the world's questions, but it revealed a truth we can no longer ignore. A new global balance is forming, and Africa is no longer on the margins. It is part of the center. So let me leave you with this. Do you believe the United States can adapt to a world where Africa speaks with strength, where countries like Burkina Faso guide their own destiny, and where leaders like Ibrahim Traore inspire millions far beyond their borders? And if not, who should shape the future in America's place? If you are one of the few who want to follow these shifts before they become headlines, this channel is for you. Please share this video if you feel you are among the first to understand the rise of the Global South. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. The world is changing, and your voice, your awareness still matters.